Sam Brooks was a man known for his stories. He wasn't famous in the traditional sense. There were no books written about him, no newspaper articles celebrating his life. But in the small town of Riverbend, everyone knew about Sam's adventures. He had lived through storms, traveled to distant lands, and encountered creatures that no one else had ever seen. Or at least that's what he claimed. Sam's son, Ethan, had grown up hearing these stories. From the time he was a little boy, his father would sit him down at the old wooden table in their living room, the one with the uneven legs, and begin telling him tales that sounded too wild to be true. "Did I ever tell you about the time I crossed the Grand Canyon on a single rope, Ethan?" Sam would say, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Ethan would sigh, already knowing what was coming next. "No, Dad, you haven't," he would reply, though he had heard the story a dozen times before. "Well, it all started on a hot summer day," Sam would begin, his voice full of energy, despite his age. "I was just a young man, maybe 20 or 21, and I was working as a tour guide in Arizona. One day, the tour bus broke down, and we were stranded on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Now, most people would have panicked, but not me. I saw it as an opportunity." Sam would lean in closer, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. "I found a rope, just a simple old rope, and I tied it between the two sides of the canyon. And then, without hesitation, I climbed onto that rope and began walking, one foot in front of the other, as the wind howled around me." Ethan couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Dad, there's no way you cross the Grand Canyon on a rope. It's over a mile wide." But Sam would only smile. But that's the thing about adventure, son. The details don't always matter. What matters is that you believe." That was how all of Sam's stories went. There was always some impossible feat, something that made Ethan question whether his father was simply making everything up. But Sam told these stories with such passion, such certainty, that it was hard not to get caught up in the fantasy. Another of Sam's favorite stories was about the time he made friends with a giant eagle. According to him, he had been hiking in the mountains when a shadow passed over him. He looked up and saw the biggest bird he had ever seen, its wings spanning the length of a small airplane. "I'll never forget that moment," Sam would say, his voice full of wonder. "The eagle swooped down and landed right in front of me. It looked me in the eye, and I could tell it wasn't just any bird. This eagle was special. It understood me. We stood there staring at each other, and I knew we had a connection." Ethan would listen, trying to hold back his skepticism. "And then what happened, Dad? Did you ride the eagle across the sky?" Sam laughed as if the idea wasn't completely ridiculous. No. But we did become friends. I would visit that mountain every year, and the eagle was always there waiting for me." The most outrageous of all Sam's tales, though, was the one about the talking forest. According to Sam, he had once been lost in a dense forest, wandering for days without any sign of civilization. Just when he thought he might never find his way out, he began to hear voices, whispers carried by the wind. "At first, I thought I was going crazy," Sam would say, his eyes widening as if he were reliving the experience. "But then I realized it was the trees. They were talking to me. They told me which way to go, and sure enough, I found my way out of the forest. I owe my life to those trees." Ethan could never decide whether his father truly believed these stories or if he was just trying to entertain. Either way, as he grew older, Ethan became less and less enchanted by Sam's tales. He no longer saw them as magical, but rather as elaborate fantasies designed to fill the quiet moments in their otherwise uneventful lives. "Dad, come on," Ethan would say. "You expect me to believe that trees talk to you? It's just not possible." Sam's smile would falter for a moment, but then he'd shrug, the twinkle in his eye never fully fading. "Maybe not, son, but sometimes the world is stranger than you think." And with that, he would leave the room, his stories lingering in the air like dust caught in a beam of sunlight. Ethan would sit there shaking his head, but part of him, just a small part, wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a bit of truth in the tales his father told. In the end, though, Ethan always convinced himself that Sam's stories were just that, stories. As Ethan grew older, his fascination with his father's stories faded, replaced by a sense of frustration. While Sam's tales had once been the highlight of his childhood, the older Ethan got, the more he questioned their authenticity. By the time he graduated college and began his career as a journalist, he had convinced himself that his father's adventures were nothing more than tall tales meant to entertain rather than inform. Still, there was a part of Ethan that couldn't let go entirely. Maybe it was because Sam told those stories with such passion, or maybe it was because Ethan wanted to believe that his father was more than just an ordinary man. Whatever the reason, Ethan found himself haunted by the idea that there might be some kernel of truth buried in Sam's outlandish claims. One evening, after yet another visit with his father, where Sam recounted the story of the talking trees for what felt like the 100th time, Ethan made a decision. He would investigate. As a journalist, uncovering the truth was his job, and he was good at it. If there was even a shred of truth in his father's stories, Ethan was determined to find it. The next morning, Ethan started where any good reporter would, with research. He dusted off old family photo albums, scoured online archives, and made phone calls to anyone who had known his father in his younger years. Sam had always been vague about the details of his past, but Ethan pieced together enough information to create a timeline of his father's life, one that stretched from the small town of Riverbend to various parts of the country. Ethan's first stop was a dusty old bar in Arizona, the place where his father claimed to have worked as a tour guide all those years ago. It was here, Sam said, that he had walked across the Grand Canyon on a rope, a story Ethan had long since written off as impossible. The bar was nothing like Ethan had imagined. It was small and unremarkable, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the desert. Faded pictures lined the walls, and a few locals nursed beers at the counter. Ethan approached the bartender, a grizzled man in his 60s who had the air of someone who had seen it all. "Excuse me," Ethan said, taking a seat at the counter. "I'm looking for some information about a man who used to work around here. His name's Sam Brooks. He said he was a tour guide in this area, maybe 20 or 30 years ago." The bartender squinted at Ethan, wiping down the counter with a stained rag. "Sam Brooks, huh?" he said, his voice rough like sandpaper. "Yeah, I remember him. Used to tell the craziest stories. Said he crossed the canyon on a rope. You believe that?" Ethan felt a mix of excitement and disbelief. Could there actually be some truth to his father's story? "So he really worked here?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. The bartender chuckled. "Oh, he worked here all right. Good guy, great with tourists. But that story about the canyon? No way. He liked to spin tales, that one. Always kept people entertained, though." Ethan sighed, feeling his hopes deflate. It was exactly what he had expected. His father had worked there, but the stories were just that. Stories. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. There were more stories to investigate. Ethan's next stop was the mountains of Montana, where his father had claimed to have befriended a giant eagle. It was another tale Ethan had dismissed as pure fantasy, but once again, curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself on a plane to Montana where he had arranged to meet an old park ranger who had worked in the area during the time Sam had supposedly made his visit. The ranger's cabin was nestled deep in the forest, and the man who greeted Ethan at the door was weathered but kind, with eyes that sparkled with an untold number of stories of his own. "You're Sam Brooks' boy, aren't you?" the ranger asked with a grin as they sat down on his porch. "I remember him. Came through here years ago. Kept going on about some eagle. Said it was the biggest bird he'd ever seen." Ethan couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, that sounds like my dad. Did you ever see the eagle?" The ranger shook his head, his smile fading slightly. "No, I never saw it. But you know, your dad wasn't the only one to talk about that eagle. I've had a few hikers over the years mention seeing a big bird, bigger than anything around here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Really?" The ranger nodded. "Could be a legend, could be something else. But folks around here believe there's something out there. Might not be as big as your dad said, but sometimes the truth's stranger than fiction." Ethan left Montana with more questions than answers. His father's stories weren't completely true, but they weren't entirely false either. There were pieces of reality hidden within the fantasy, enough to make Ethan wonder just how much of Sam's life was rooted in truth. His final stop was a remote forest in Oregon, the place where Sam claimed to have been saved by talking trees. Ethan didn't expect to find much here. Talking trees were, after all, the most far-fetched of all his father's tales. As he wandered through the thick woods, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The towering trees stretched high above him, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. He stopped for a moment, closed his eyes, and listened. There were no voices, no whispers from the trees, but the forest was alive in its own way. Maybe that was what his father had been trying to say all along. The world had a way of speaking to those who were willing to listen. Ethan opened his eyes and smiled. He didn't need to find talking trees or giant eagles to understand his father. Sam's stories were a blend of truth and imagination, a way to bring magic into an ordinary life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Ethan's investigation had taken him across states, from dusty bars in Arizona to dense forests in Oregon. He had pieced together fragments of his father's stories, each encounter leaving him more conflicted than before. The stories weren't completely false, but they weren't entirely true either. Sam's life existed in a gray area, somewhere between fantasy and reality. But there was still one place left to visit, a small, remote town in the mountains of Colorado, the last piece of the puzzle. The town of Evergreen Valley was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. It was nestled in the shadow of towering peaks, with a single main street lined with old wooden buildings that hadn't changed in decades. As Ethan stepped out of his car, he was struck by how peaceful it all felt, as if this town had somehow escaped the rush of the outside world. Ethan had heard about Evergreen Valley from a letter his father had written to his mother many years ago. In the letter, Sam described it as a place where the unbelievable became real. Ethan hadn't understood what his father meant by that, but he was determined to find out. He made his way to the local diner, the only place in town that seemed to have any signs of life. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in, and the few patrons inside turned to look at him. Their eyes lingered a little longer than usual, as if they could tell he didn't belong there. Ethan approached the counter, where a woman in her 60s was pouring coffee. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore an apron that had seen better days. When she noticed Ethan, she smiled warmly. "Morning, stranger," she said, her voice soft but firm. "What can I get for you?" Ethan smiled back, feeling a bit out of place. "Just a coffee, please," he said, sitting down on one of the stools. As she poured the steaming liquid into a chipped mug, Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had brought him there. "By any chance," he began slowly, "do you remember a man named Sam Brooks? He would have been here years ago." The woman froze for just a moment, the coffee pot hovering above the counter. Then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "Sam Brooks," she repeated as if testing the name on her tongue. "Oh, I remember Sam. Hard to forget a man like that." Ethan leaned forward. "You knew him?" The woman set the coffee pot down and leaned on the counter, her eyes twinkling with something Ethan couldn't quite place. "Knew him? Honey, everyone in this town knew Sam. He stayed here for a while, years ago. And let me tell you, he left an impression." Ethan's heart raced. This was it. Maybe this town held the key to understanding the truth behind his father's stories. "What kind of impression?" he asked eagerly. Did he do anything unusual while he was here?" The woman laughed softly, but it wasn't a mocking laugh. It was more like she knew a secret that Ethan wasn't in on. "Oh, he did plenty of unusual things," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "But that's the thing about Sam. He made the unusual feel normal." Before Ethan could press for more details, one of the patrons, an elderly man sitting in the corner, spoke up. "You talking about Sam Brooks?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. "I remember him. Came through here. What, 40 years ago? Stayed at the old inn up the hill." The man's eyes met Ethan's, and he gave him the same mysterious smile the woman had. "You know, he was always going on about strange things. Said he found something special in these mountains. But he never explained what." Ethan frowned. "Something special? What do you mean?" The old man shrugged, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Could have been anything. Sam had a way of making the ordinary seem magical. People say he saw things no one else did. But who knows what's true and what's just a good story? Ethan's frustration grew. It was the same answer he'd been getting everywhere he went. No one could give him a straight answer. But as much as he wanted to believe his father's stories were pure fiction, there was something about this town, something about the way everyone spoke of Sam, that made him wonder if there was more to the story. "Look," Ethan said, trying to stay patient, "I've spent months trying to figure out what's real and what's not. My father told stories that no one else seems to believe, but you all talk about him like he did something important here. Can anyone tell me exactly what happened?" The old man looked at Ethan for a long time, his weathered face unreadable. Then he stood up, slowly making his way toward the door. "You want answers, kid," he said over his shoulder. "Talk to old Jim. He's the one who knew your father best." Ethan watched as the man left the diner, his words hanging in the air. The woman behind the counter nodded in agreement. "Old Jim lives in a cabin just outside of town," she said. "He and your father were close." Without another word, Ethan paid for his coffee and made his way to old Jim's cabin, his mind racing with questions. If anyone had the answers, it would be this mysterious man who had known Sam so well. When Ethan arrived at the cabin, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. Small and weathered, with ivy creeping up the sides and a large oak tree towering overhead. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, an elderly man opened it. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his eyes were sharp, filled with a wisdom that only comes with age. "You must be Sam's boy," Jim said, his voice rough but welcoming. "Come in, I've been expecting you." Ethan stepped inside, his heart pounding. As Jim led him to a chair, Ethan could feel the weight of the moment. He had spent his whole life chasing the truth behind his father's stories. And now here, in this small cabin, he was about to discover just how unbelievable that truth might be. Jim sat down across from Ethan, his gaze steady. "You want to know about your father?" he said quietly. "And I'll tell you this. Sam Brooks was a man who saw the world differently. Some say he was a dreamer, others say he was a fool. But me, I think he understood something the rest of us don't." Ethan leaned in, hanging on every word. "What do you mean?" Jim smiled, that same mysterious smile Ethan had seen so many times before. "Your father did things. Unbelievable things. But here's the trick, kid. The line between reality and fantasy, it's thinner than you think." Ethan left old Jim's cabin with his mind spinning. Jim's words echoed in his head. The line between reality and fantasy, it's thinner than you think. For so long, Ethan had been determined to separate the truth from the embellishment in his father's stories. But now he wasn't so sure that was the point. Maybe his father had understood something deeper, something that went beyond facts and fiction. Over the next few weeks, Ethan continued his investigation, though his approach had changed. Instead of focusing solely on disproving the impossible, he began looking for the small grains of truth hidden within the larger-than-life tales. And to his surprise, those grains began to appear. It started with a letter he found while sorting through his father's old belongings. The letter was addressed to a man named Jack Turner, an old friend of Sam's from his youth. Jack had lived in a small town near the Grand Canyon, the same place where Sam claimed to have crossed the canyon on a single rope. Intrigued, Ethan tracked down Jack, hoping to finally put that story to rest. When he arrived at Jack's modest house, the old man greeted him warmly, though he seemed surprised to see someone asking about Sam. As they sat on the porch sipping iced tea, Ethan finally asked about the infamous canyon story. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Your dad, he sure loved to tell that one, didn't he? The truth is, Sam and I did hike near the Grand Canyon. But crossing it on a rope? Nah. What actually happened was, well, there was a bridge, an old rickety one, and Sam decided to climb across the outside of it, just for fun. No safety gear, no second thoughts. Scared the life out of me." Ethan smiled, picturing the scene in his head. Of course, his father had taken a real event and turned it into something legendary. But the core of the story, the courage, the thrill of adventure, was real. Sam may not have walked a tightrope across the Grand Canyon, but he had still taken a risk most people wouldn't dare. That was the part that mattered. As Ethan continued his search, he found more stories like this. The giant eagle his father had supposedly befriended. In reality, it was a large golden eagle that Sam had seen while hiking in Montana. According to a park ranger Ethan spoke to, Sam had spent hours watching the bird, mesmerized by its majesty and grace. While the bird never became his companion, the experience had clearly left a deep impression on him, one that had grown into a story of mythical friendship. Even the tale of the talking forest had roots in reality. Ethan discovered that his father had once been lost in a forest during a camping trip in Oregon. After days of wandering, he had stumbled upon an old cabin where a family lived. They had taken him in, fed him, and shown him the way back to civilization. It wasn't the trees that had spoken to Sam, but rather the kindness of strangers. In his father's mind, the forest had been alive in its own way, through the people he had encountered. As these stories unfolded, Ethan began to see a pattern. His father's tales weren't lies. They were just a different way of viewing the world. Sam had a knack for finding magic in the mundane, for turning everyday events into grand adventures. What Ethan had once dismissed as exaggeration, he now saw as a celebration of life's wonder. It was during one quiet evening, while sitting in his apartment surrounded by his father's old letters and photos, that Ethan had a moment of clarity. His father's stories weren't about the events themselves, they were about perspective. Sam had used his imagination to stretch the boundaries of reality, not to deceive, but to inspire. He saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. His stories weren't just adventures, they were lessons in how to live fully, without fear, and with an appreciation for the unknown. Ethan leaned back in his chair, thinking about all the times he had rolled his eyes at his father's stories, refusing to believe them. He had spent so much of his life trying to separate fact from fiction, when maybe the beauty of those stories was that they didn't need to be either. They were simply reflections of a man who had lived with an open heart and an adventurous spirit. In that moment, Ethan felt a deep sense of acceptance. He didn't need to know if every detail of his father's stories was true. What mattered was the message behind them, the courage to explore, the joy of discovery, and the belief that the world was filled with possibilities, even if they weren't always obvious at first glance. As Ethan packed away his father's belongings, he realized that his journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth behind Sam's adventures. It was about learning to see the world the way his father had, with wonder, curiosity, and a little bit of magic. He might never know exactly what had happened during those years of his father's life, but in the end, that didn't matter. What mattered was that Sam had lived a life full of stories, and through those stories, he had taught Ethan to embrace the extraordinary, even in the most ordinary of moments. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself smiling at the memory of his father's voice, telling him about the Grand Canyon, the giant eagle, and the talking trees. He no longer needed to know if they were real. The magic was in the telling. Time passed and the seasons changed. Ethan had come to terms with his father's stories, accepting them for what they were, pieces of a larger truth about life and how it should be lived. But as much as Ethan had learned to embrace his father's unique way of seeing the world, life was about to teach him another lesson. Time, no matter how fantastical the stories that fill it, cannot be stopped. Sam's health had been declining for some time, but Ethan had always assumed he had more time. His father had lived so fully, so fearlessly, that it was hard to imagine anything slowing him down. But one afternoon, Ethan received a phone call from his mother. Sam had been in and out of the hospital, and now the doctor said there wasn't much time left. Without hesitation, Ethan packed his bags and headed back to Riverbend. The drive felt longer than usual, the winding roads and familiar landscape blurring together in a haze of worry and nostalgia. By the time he reached his childhood home, the air was thick with the weight of what was coming. Inside, Sam lay in his bed, thinner and more fragile than Ethan had ever seen him. But his eyes still held that familiar twinkle, even if the rest of him had faded. When Ethan entered the room, Sam looked up and smiled, his voice weak but warm. "Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're here." Ethan sat down by his father's bedside, trying to hold back the emotion that was threatening to spill over. "Of course I'm here, Dad," he said, reaching for Sam's hand. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." For a while they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan found himself thinking about all the stories his father had told over the years, how they had once seemed so absurd, but now felt like priceless memories. He didn't know how to say goodbye, but he knew this moment was coming. As if sensing Ethan's thoughts, Sam smiled again. "I've got one more story for you, son," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. Ethan braced himself for another fantastical tale, maybe one about a lost treasure or an enchanted island. But Sam surprised him. "This one's different," Sam said, his eyes softening. "It's about your mother." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mother, who had always quietly supported Sam's stories but never added to them, had been a steady presence in their lives. She was practical, grounded, and never the subject of Sam's adventures. But now it seemed her story was the one Sam wanted to tell. "I was a young man when I met her," Sam began, his gaze distant, as if he was seeing the past play out before him. "I was restless back then, always searching for something. Adventure, excitement. I thought that was the key to a full life. But when I met your mother, everything changed." Ethan listened closely, captivated by the simplicity of his father's words. There were no eagles, no talking trees, no daring escapes from danger. Instead, Sam spoke of the day he met a quiet, kind woman named Mary at a local bookstore. She had been sitting by the window reading a novel, and Sam had been drawn to her without really knowing why. "I went up to her and tried to impress her with one of my stories," Sam said, chuckling softly. "I told her about a wild adventure I had in the Amazon rainforest. But she didn't seem interested in any of that. She just smiled at me and asked what my favorite book was." Sam's eyes grew distant again, his voice quieter now. "That was the first time I realized that maybe life didn't have to be one big adventure. Maybe, just maybe, the real adventure was finding someone who made you feel like you didn't need to chase excitement anymore. With your mother, I didn't need to make things bigger than they were. Life with her was enough." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. His story was different from anything Sam had ever told. It wasn't about the impossible or the unbelievable. It was about something simple, something real. And it hit Ethan harder than any of the other stories ever had. Sam smiled weakly, turning his head toward Ethan. "You know, all those stories I told you, they were never about the things I saw or the places I went. They were about how I felt. They were about finding magic in life, even in the small things. And your mother, she was the most magical thing that ever happened to me." Ethan couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They slid down his face, silent and unstoppable. He reached for his father's hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand now, Dad," he whispered. "I understand why you told those stories." Sam looked at him, his eyes full of a deep, quiet love. "I knew you would, eventually. Life isn't about what's real or what's imagined, Ethan. It's about what you make of it. Your mother and I, we made a life together, one full of stories and love. And that's all that matters in the end." For a long time they sat in the stillness of the room, father and son, sharing the weight of a lifetime of stories. Ethan realized that this final story, the one about his parents' love, was the truest of them all. It wasn't wrapped in fantasy or stretched by imagination. It was simple, honest, and filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from living a full life. Sam's breathing grew softer, and his grip on Ethan's hand loosened. "Tell your own stories, Ethan," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "And remember, it's not the details that matter. It's how you live them." Ethan nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I will, Dad. I promise." And with that, Sam closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face. The man who had spent his life spinning stories, who had blurred the line between fantasy and reality, had told his last tale. And for the first time, Ethan didn't need to know if it was real or not. He understood that the truth had always been there, woven into the heart of every story. As the sun set outside the window, casting the room in a warm, golden glow, Ethan sat quietly beside his father, holding his hand, grateful for the stories that had shaped their lives.